From just a person that likes to help out to the commander of the pact, the player embarks on a journey that ultimately leads them to Or and the elder dragon, Zhaitan. Today we're gonna deep dive into the core game's story from start to finish. This is going to be a big project, so I'll break it up in parts, with this being part 1. I will try to do my best in exploring the impact Zhaitan's rise had on all the races, not just the playable ones, as well as discover details and other things that are not explored through gameplay. Please follow along as we go through the full core game story of Guild Wars 2. So hello, welcome to my channel. Here we learn the lore and stories of Tyria, and as always, you can find the full lore on the official Guild Wars 2 wiki. Let's begin. A world after the Dragons Awoke. For thousands of years, Tyria had existed beneath the shadow of legends. Ancient civilizations had risen and fallen, kingdoms had expanded and disappeared, great heroes had walked the world and great villains had threatened to destroy it. The races of Tyria had fought countless wars against one another, believing their greatest dangers came from rival nations, invading armies or enemies standing just beyond their borders. But beneath all those conflicts, beneath the history remembered by kings and scholars, something far older had been waiting. The Elder Dragons. They were not creatures like those found in ordinary stories. They were not rulers seeking kingdoms, nor conquerors seeking subjects. They were forces of nature. Ancient beings connected to a cycle that stretched back beyond recorded history, rising again and again to consume magic, reshape the world, and return it to a state of silence before eventually falling into dormancy. For generations, Tyria had been protected from their return. But protection was not the same as safety, because eventually, the Dragons awoke. The first signs were not immediately understood. Across the world, strange events began occurring. Creatures changed, magic became unstable, ancient dangers returned. Places that had been forgotten began revealing themselves again. At first, many believed those were separate problems. A monster attack here, a strange phenomenon there, a forgotten ruin becoming dangerous. The nations of Tyria were used to conflict. They knew how to fight enemies they could see. Bandits could be hunted, armies could be defeated, political disputes could be negotiated. But the Elder Dragons were different. They were not a kingdom, they were not an army, they were something much older. And when they began to rise, the world slowly realized that the old ways of fighting would no longer be enough. The world after the Guild Wars. The modern age of Tyria was already a world shaped by conflict. Humanity, once the dominant power of the continent, had lost much of its former influence. The great kingdom of Ascalon had been destroyed by the Foe Fire, a magical catastrophe caused by King Adalbern during the final days of the Third Guild War. The land remained haunted by the ghosts of those who had died there, and the Char, once enemies of humanity, had reclaimed their homeland. Kryta remained one of the last major human kingdoms, struggling against political instability, bandits, and the mysterious influence of the White Mantle. The Char had rebuilt their society around the legions, replacing the old ways of the Flame Legion with military discipline and technology. The Asura had returned from the depths of Tyria after being driven from their underground cities by the Destroyers, rebuilding their civilization around their brilliant but often dangerous inventions. The Norn had moved south from the far Shiver Peaks after the rise of the Elder Dragon Jormag, carrying their traditions and their belief in personal strength into unfamiliar lands. And the Sylvari were the youngest race of Tyria, born only 25 years before the events of Guild Wars 2, awakening from the Pale Tree with no ancient empire behind them and no centuries of history to guide them. Each race had its own struggles, each had its own wounds, but the awakening of the Elder Dragons began changing the question everyone had been asking. The question was no longer, who will rule Tyria? The question became, will Tyria survive at all? The heroes of a changing age. Every great conflict begins with ordinary people standing before extraordinary challenges. The heroes who would eventually shape Tyria's future did not begin as commanders, generals or legends. They began as individuals trying to protect the people around them. Their stories were different because their worlds were different. The Char, a soldier in the legions. Among the Char, strength was not measured by birth or tradition, it was earned. The Char had spent centuries fighting against humanity, but after overthrowing the false gods and tyrannical rule of the Flame Legion, their society had changed. The legions became the foundation of their civilization. The Iron Legion embraced technology and invention. The Blood Legion valued warriors and battlefield honor. The Ash Legion mastered secrecy, espionage and intelligence. A young Char seeking to make their mark did not look toward nobility or heritage, they looked toward service. The battlefield was where reputations were created. And the Char heroes' first challenge would come from a threat that represented the old enemies of their people, the renegade Flame Legion and their continued attempts to reclaim power. The Human, a defender of Kryta. Humanity's age of dominance had ended, but humanity itself had not disappeared. In Kryta, people continued rebuilding despite constant threats. The Centaur armies pressed against the kingdom's borders, bandits preyed upon civilians, the White Mantle continued their secretive schemes. And beneath all of it remained the knowledge that humanity had lost much of what it once possessed. A human hero did not begin their journey seeking to restore an empire, they began by protecting their home. By proving that even in a world where humanity was no longer the strongest force, courage still mattered. The Norn, a hunter seeking greatness. The Norn believed that life was a story written through actions. They followed the spirits of the wild, sought personal glory, and measured themselves against the greatest challenges they could find. But the return of the Elder Dragons had changed their homeland. Jormag's rise had forced many Norn south, away from the lands their ancestors had called home. The Norn hero carried that history with them. They did not fight only for survival, they fought to prove themselves, to create a legend worthy of being remembered. The Asura, genius against the unknown. The Asura believed intelligence was the greatest weapon. Their civilization had been forced above ground by the rise of the destroyers, but they had rebuilt themselves through invention and experimentation. Their greatest minds created technologies beyond the understanding of many other races. But intelligence could also create arrogance. The Asuran hero would learn that not every problem could be solved through calculations and machines. Some threats were too ancient, too powerful, too unpredictable. The Sylvari, a new race in an ancient world. The Sylvari were different from every other race. They had no ancient kingdom, no forgotten empire, no generations of recorded history. They were young. Born from the pale tree, they entered the world with curiosity, questions, and the desire to understand their place within it. But their youth did not make them weak. The Sylvari possessed a connection to the world unlike any other race. Through the Dream of Dreams, they experienced shared visions before awakening into the world. Among these visions came warnings, dreams of danger, dreams of dragons, and for some Sylvari, dreams connected to a purpose they did not yet understand. The first step toward legend. The hero's journey began before the world knew their name. Before the pact, before the battles in Or, before the fight with Saitan. They were simply someone willing to stand when others needed help. Their first victories were not against Elder Dragons. They were against the threats that existed around them every day. Enemies who believed ordinary people could be exploited. Creatures that threatened innocent lives. Forces that believed nobody would oppose them. But every hero begins the same way, not by saving the world, by saving one person, then another, and then another. The hero did not know it yet, but their actions were already drawing attention. Across Tyria, others were also preparing for the coming storm. Scholars searched ancient records, soldiers trained for battles they hoped would never come. Spies gathered information about threats moving through the shadows, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the Elder Dragons continued to awaken. The world was changing, the old age was ending, a new generation would have to rise. And among them would be the first person who would eventually stand at the center of the greatest conflict Tyria had ever faced. But first, they had to survive the beginning. A world larger than one hero. The hero's early victories brought recognition, but they also revealed a larger truth. The threats facing Tyria were connected. The bandits, monsters and corrupted creatures and political conflict were not the same as the Elder Dragon threat, but they existed in a world already being affected by the changes brought by the dragon's return. The balance of the world was shifting, and the people who understood this best were those who studied history, those who investigated mysteries, those who watched from the shadows. The first signs of larger conflict were not always obvious. A strange creature appearing in the wrong place, an ancient ruin revealing secrets that should have remained buried. Reports of unusual activity connected to forces that most people believed were only legends. The hero would soon discover that Tyria was filled with hidden histories. And among those histories was the story of a group of heroes whose actions had already shaped the world. The legacy of Destiny's Edge. Before the hero's name was known, before the pact existed, and before the nations of Tyria united against Satan, there had been another group that believed they could change the course of history. They were called Destiny's Edge. They were a group of extraordinary individuals who believed that a small number of heroes could stand against threats that entire kingdoms struggled to face. The group consisted of Stagalkin, the legendary Norn ranger and warrior, Ritlock Brimstone, the Char Blood Legion Tribune, Logan Thackeray, a human warrior and member of the Seraph, Soja, an Asura inventor and member of the College of Synergetics, Keith, a Sylvari thief with a mysterious connection to the world around her, and Snaf, another Asura inventor and Soja's mentor. Together, they challenged the Elder Dragons when few understood the danger they represented. They believed they could defeat them, but they discovered something every hero eventually learns: courage alone is not always enough. Their greatest failure came during the battle against Kralkatorik, the Elder Dragon of Crystal. The battle did not end the way they had hoped. The majority of the group survived, but Snaf was killed by Kralkatorik. And so, the trust between them shattered. Old friendships fractured, arguments became wounds. The heroes who had once fought side by side went their separate ways. Destiny's Edge became a reminder that even legendary heroes could fail. But failure did not mean the end. It only meant the story was unfinished. The hero didn't know it yet, but their path would eventually cross with broken members of Destiny's Edge. Their journey would become connected to a story that had begun years earlier. A story about friendship, about regret. A story about whether people who had lost faith in each other could find a reason to stand together again. The first signs of the Elder Dragons. As the hero continued their journey, the wider world became impossible to ignore. The Elder Dragons were no longer distant legends, their influence was spreading. In the north, Jormag's corruption continued affecting the lands of the Norn. In the depths beneath Tyria, Primordus's destroyers threatened the underground world. Across the seas, the rise of Satan had transformed the ancient kingdom of Or into a nightmare of undeath. The dragons were not simply attacking nations, they were changing the world itself. The heroes stood at the beginning of a path they could not yet understand. They had won battles, they had protected people, they had proven themselves. But those victories were only the first steps. Soon, they would be asked to choose not only how they fought, but who they would fight beside. This has been the first part in this deep dive of the core game's story. I hope you enjoyed this video. This part was basically a description of how Tyria looked during the time of the dragon's rise, and to get the backdrop as to when our story begins. In the next part, we'll explore the story of when the hero, or the player, gets more recognized and is introduced to the orders they will eventually join and fight for, as well as go into detail on the mentors the player has. With that said, thank you for watching this video. Please like and comment something you thought was interesting or something that I missed. Also subscribe to not miss future lore content in this format. Now take care, and I will see you in the next story. Goodbye.